Here pretty quick, so please find a seat. Welcome to this month's First Monday Speaker Series. My name is Thaddeus Van Essendelft, co-chair of Student Symposium. On behalf of the Co-Curricular Committee and the Andreas Center, I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Carol Simon as our speaker this morning. Dr. Carolyn Simon serves as the Provost and Executive Vice President at Whitworth University. Prior to her career at Whitworth, Dr. Simon taught at Hope College in Holland, Michigan for 25 years as a professor of philosophy. In addition, she held other leadership positions, including the Director of General Education and Interdisciplinary Studies and Associate Dean for Teaching and Learning. While performing these tasks, Dr. Simon has written as a philosophical ethicist, authoring several books on virtue, moral knowledge, and human affection. Some of these titles include The Disciplined Heart, Love, Destiny, and Imagination, and Bringing Sex into Focus, The Quest for Sexual Integrity. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Simon.
Well, thank you. It's great to be here. Dort is beautiful. You've gotten great weather for me. It's a little chilly, but just gorgeous. And so I'm so happy to be here. I'm going to stick with the manuscript in order to stick with time, and hopefully we can move this along. I want to also thank those who made arrangements for my stay. I feel very welcomed and cared for here. This is what our culture shows us are the two options regarding sex. What are our choices? On the one hand, as the caption indicates, the joy of no sex. And the joy here is ironic and tongue-in-cheek. Our culture depicts the no-sex option as drab, cramped, and unnatural. On the other hand, we have booty camp, a choice that our culture tells us is powerful, exciting, and enlivening. This choice is what philosophers call a false dilemma. The world of sexuality is much more complex than this, but to see that, we need to bring sex into sharper focus. My talk today has three parts. First, I want to talk about 6 sexual lenses through which sexuality is viewed in our culture. Second, I want to talk about what I call false sightings, some illusions shared by many people about how the sexual lenses fit together. And finally, I want to recommend strategies for sharpening our vision about the area of sexuality. So 3 parts: 6 sexual lenses, false sightings, and then sharpening our sexual focus. So let's turn to the 6 sexual lenses. I'm going to explain these by introducing you to 6 fictional people who see the world totally through a single sexual lens. First, let's meet Penelope, who sees sex through what I call the plain sex lens. Penelope is grateful that she was born in 1996 and not 1946. One big reason for this is that she's never known a world in which there wasn't reliable and convenient contraception. Unlike her grandmother, she's been able to have sex without worrying about becoming pregnant. She thinks of pregnancy as an accidental biological byproduct of sexual activity, a byproduct that she can control at will. She practices safe sex. She's also read a lot of sex manuals. She's become deft at achieving and giving orgasms. Seeing sex through the plain sex lens, Penelope sees sexuality as nothing more than an acute physical desire for an intensely pleasurable physical activity. Though Penelope has had a lot of sexual partners, we shouldn't think that she lacks standards. She thinks that it's vital for there to be mutual consent to all sexual activities. She also thinks that sex should lead to mutual sexual satisfaction. Her sexual partners may be props in service of her sexual pleasure, but she makes sure that they are willing and happy props. Next, meet Pierre. Pierre thinks that Penelope oversimplifies sex. Pierre sees sex through the power lens. Pierre realizes that interpersonal power dynamics are deeply entrenched in our sexual being and interactions. He knows that sex is never just about pleasure. Sex is also about power. Sexual desire and sexual activity heighten our awareness of both our powers as erotic beings and of our vulnerability. Sexual interaction lays us bare and can strip us of control as we surrender to desire. Yet Pierre knows that sexuality also is a potent instrument for controlling others. He is invigorated by knowing that he can command women's sexual attention. But he's also read Jean-Paul Sartre in his sophomore philosophy class, so he also knows that sexuality puts him at the mercy of another person's way of seeing. He knows that men can also be turned into sex objects. He knows that a powerful woman might manipulate him even while he thinks that he is the one calling the shots. She might set him aside and dismiss him. As Pierre learned from reading D.H. Lawrence in his lit class, the power dynamics inherent in sexuality are, at their darkest, the root of the link between sex and violence. Pierre would never force himself on a woman. He's not a rapist, but he does think of sex as a competitive sport. He's proud of his scorecard, and he brags to his buddies about every sexual conquest. Pierre also took a women's studies course, a great place to meet babes, he says to his friends. In that class, Pierre learned that the link between sex and power is often subtle and complex. They studied this cover of Rolling Stone magazine that depicts the rock group Destiny's Child. These women are dressed in skimpy military garb and are taking sexually provocative poses. The image at one level shows that these women are sexually empowered, but the subtext is that they are also sexually available to the presupposed male viewer. Pierre is very grateful that the fashion industry has convinced women that dressing sexy makes them powerful. He likes what he sees. Pierre believes that the rule number one in sex is self-protection. Since sex and power are a potent and murky mix, he enters every hookup with his eyes wide open. He's savvy about the potential for exploitation and manipulation. He doesn't ever want to be nominated or owned by some woman. Elise sees sex differently than both Penelope and Pierre. Because she looks at sex through the expressivist lens, she focuses on the role of sexuality within personal development. She thinks that sexual expression can be creative and empowering without being an exertion of power over someone else. Sex makes her feel alive, generous, open to the world. Elise read theologian Carter Hayward in her feminist theology class and loved Hayward's summary of what the world looks like through the expressive lens. She loved how Hayward celebrated the erotic and how she said that sexual expression ought to be a major issue in our lives together because it is the primary wellspring of our capacity to be creative together. Elise believes that sexual expression is empowering and that sexual restraint diminishes and warps the self. Elise thinks that Penelope is silly not to see that sexuality is something much more important than a desire for pleasure, however intense. Elise sees sexuality and sexual activity as central to her identity. She thinks that foregoing sexual intercourse makes people less than fully human. Elise agrees with Sigmund Freud that sexual repression is a source of many serious psychological problems. Raymond sees sex through the romantic lens. He's always believed that sexual intercourse should be reserved for when you've found someone you deeply love and who loves you in return. Raymond sees his sexual desires as connected with a thirst for deep psychological and bodily knowledge. He disapproves of casual sex. Sex is about intimacy, about mutuality and gift-giving. That's why he's so glad to have met Nancy during his first year of college. They've been sleeping together for 2 years now and expect that they'll move in together during their senior year. Raymond and Nancy didn't just jump into bed together. First, they were friends. Then he started taking her out, sent her flowers, the whole deal. As a romantic, Raymond sees sexual anticipation as almost as important as intercourse. Nancy loves this about him. His patience has paid off. Nancy is his soulmate. He'd never cheat on her. Other women might be attractive, but Nancy is the one. But every once in a while, Raymond is worried. He knows that his dad once felt just exactly this way about his mom. They got married because they were in love with each other. But then his dad fell out of love with his mom and fell in love with someone else. Raymond was angry with his dad at first, but now that he's in love, he understands. How could you continue in a loveless marriage if you had finally found the one? Pauline sees sex very differently than any of these four people that we've talked about so far. Pauline is a devout Roman Catholic, and she sees sex through the procreative lens. Pauline knows that God designed the sexual organs for a purpose, and that purpose is making babies. Pauline was taught in sexual education class that she had at her Catholic high school that actions that are fully, wholesomely sexual must be open to producing children. Sex must be heterosexual, genital, and embrace the hope of offspring. She believes that uses of sexuality that are intentionally non-procreative are morally impermissible. Rendering intercourse into a non-life-transmitting act by using a condom or birth control pills perverts its very nature. So Pauline knows she needs to stay a virgin until she marries and then use what her church calls natural family planning. She knows that if she does this, God will see that she and her husband have just the number of children that he wants her to bring into the world. Clyde agrees with Pauline about waiting to have sex until he's married. But as a Protestant, he finds Catholic teachings about contraception hard to swallow. He doesn't believe that contraception distorts marital sexual relations. Clyde sees sex through the covenantal lens. Clyde sees full sexual expression as an enactment of two individuals being united within one new shared identity. Clyde knows that the Bible teaches that the union of a husband and wife is a mystery analogous to the union of Christ and the church. He knows that sexual intercourse should be an embodiment of a solemn pledge made at the marriage ceremony. And Clyde believes that taking sex lightly is not just disloyal to his future wife, but is an affront to God. This is why the traditional ceremony for weddings contains the word, "What God has joined together, let no man put asunder." Clyde sees becoming one flesh as a life-uniting act. Penelope, Pierre, Elise, Raymond, Pauline, and Clyde each see sex in a certain normative way. They see some ways of being sexual as normal, natural, and better. They see some ways of relating sexually as substandard and wrong. But they have substantial disagreements about what sexual norms one should practice. Many of the major debates in our society about sexuality are rooted in an unreflective way in one or more of these sexual lenses. Differing views give contrasting recommendations for how to best live our lives as sexual beings. I want now to turn to three pictures of how these lenses should be combined that are common in our culture. I think all three of these pictures are false. The first of these pictures looks like this. The idea depicted here is that different lenses can be picked up and put down at will. Different lenses are appropriate for different circumstances and in different times of life. The idea depicted here is that plain sex is a natural way to start in your dating scene. When a person is young, he or she will naturally be exploring sexually. People at this stage will hook up more or less casually. They will date lots of different people, and they will often be sexually intimate with those people without sex meaning much beyond pleasure. Eventually, if they're fortunate, they'll find someone that they fall in love with. At that point, they will be sexually faithful to that person because they will now see sex through the romantic lens. That will last until they either break up with their lover or decide to marry. Breaking up will put them back into the hunting mode. They will lapse back into plain sex until they fall in love again. If they get married, they will set aside the plain sex lens and will do their best to combine the romantic lens with either the covenantal lens or the procreative lens. What's wrong with this picture? One thing that this picture ignores is that sexual lenses cannot be picked up and put down at will. These lenses are embodied in forms of life. How we live shapes our habits and our habitual ways of seeing. The longer we participate in one way of life, and the way of life shaped by the plain sex lens, the deeper the habit of seeing sexual partners as interchangeable sources of pleasure will be. One reason that divorce rates are so high in our culture is because many people try to live out this false and unlivable picture of how sexuality works. Here's another false picture that is common in our culture. This picture sees the plain sex view as natural for males and the romantic view as natural for females. Guys are naturally after sex and gals are looking for love, so the story goes. It's natural for guys to pressure girls into escalating sexual intimacy. It's natural for gals to try to hold out until they get some sign that guys want more than sex. One reason that this is a false picture is that it's based on gender stereotypes. A more important reason that it's a false picture is because it hides the power dynamics that are just below the surface of this picture. What is really going on here is that each person is hiding what they're really after. After each of them, and each of them is manipulating the other. Each person wants to make the other over into a character in their own personal drama. A third false picture is this one. This is a picture held by some in the Christian community. The idea here is that given that Protestant Christians know that the covenantal lens is true, it's our job to defend the covenantal lens against the other 5 lenses. Our task as Christian disciples is to shape our sensibilities and desires so that we live as if we see sexuality only through this covenantal lens. So this picture says that Clyde should ignore anything that Penelope, Pierre, Elise, Raymond, and Pauline have to say. This is a false picture because the covenantal lens doesn't show us all that's important about sexuality. The covenantal view is always embodied in cultural environments that are shaped to some extent by these other sexual lenses. This is inevitable. Why do I say that the covenantal lens on its own doesn't show us enough about sexuality? The covenantal view reveals the boundaries within which sexual intercourse should happen, that sexual intercourse should happen within marriage. The covenantal view also tells us that husbands and wives should fulfill their marital duties to one another, as it tells us in 1 Corinthians. But beyond that, the covenantal view doesn't say enough about the psychophysical dynamics of how sexuality should be lived out. C.S. Lewis had something to say about this several decades ago in his book, The Four Loves. Lewis pointed out that there have been historical periods in which the covenantal view was combined with what I call the plain sex view. Lewis notes, most of our ancestors were married off in early youth to partners chosen by their parents on grounds that had nothing to do with romantic sexual love. They went to the act of sexual intercourse with no other fuel, so to speak, than plain animal desire. And they did right. Honest Christian husbands and wives obeying their fathers and mothers, discharging to one another their marital debt, and bringing up families in the fear of the Lord. So says C.S. Lewis. In earlier periods in the Western world, and in a variety of other places up to the present time, marriage has been a matter of family continuity, economic necessity, and social stability. Fathers arranged their children's marriages and gave their daughters away to fitting suitors. Husbands may or may not have cared about the sexual satisfaction of their wives. Wives in many historical periods and in many places around the world were presumed to put up with sex as a price of producing children and keeping their husbands content. The sexual relations within these marriages were sanctioned by the marriage covenant, and as long as they were consensual and non-abusive, they were morally permissible. Yet the marital sex within such marriages was impoverished. Sex that is not just covenantal, but it's also expressive of romantic attachment, richly pleasurable for both spouses, and not contaminated by distorted power dynamics, is better sex. If many Western Christians in the 21st century take that for granted, this is not because this is embedded in the covenantal view of sexuality. Contemporary Christians are used to viewing sexuality through multiple lenses, whether they realize it or not. And I think that this can be a very good thing. Sex that is not just covenantal, but which provides a proper place for pleasure, romance, and procreation, nourishes marital love better than sex that lacks these features. So we need all 6 lenses, but we need to make sure that they're combined in the right way. In the time remaining, I want to turn to some suggestions about how to clarify our vision about sexuality. This is what the world looks like to me without my glasses. I'm grateful for optometry. Without optometry, I would have a hard time navigating the world, making a living, or for that matter, living at all. I think this is why the human lifespan is increased so much, not just good nutrition, but good optometry. For years now, my optometrist has been swinging a machine like this one in front of my face. This machine is called a phoropter, and it contains lenses that can be rotated and dropped into place. During an eye exam, vision often gets blurrier before it gets better, and an oft-repeated question is it clearer now? Eventually, vision moves from blurry to increasing clarity. I don't have a sexual phoropter, and I don't know how to order one, but a phoropter is a useful metaphor for thinking about bringing sex into focus, because it helps us see that combining multiple lenses in a way that yields convergence results in clearer vision. I believe that perspectives of the multiple lenses converging on clarity about sexuality results from the covenantal lens being the central organizing lens. This brings sexuality into focus. The covenantal view is enriched by what the other 5 lenses reveal. When placed at the center of our sexual vision, the covenantal lens can put the other 5 lenses in their proper place. But we need to be careful here. Many Christians describe their view of sexuality as covenantal, but in practice have a romantic or expressive view of sexuality as their central governing paradigm. Such Christians view being in love as a sufficient condition for legitimizing sexual intercourse. Such Christians may endorse premarital sex between people who are in love and committed to eventual marriage. Such Christians may also view having fallen in love with someone other than their spouse as a justification for divorce and remarriage. The Christian tradition teaches that it's important that the covenantal lens not just be central, but dominant in order to have a full and faithful sexual insight. When the covenantal lens is central and dominant, Christianity recommends the cultivation of chastity as the chief sexual virtue. Chastity is not popular, but that's because chastity is too often misidentified as a kind of grim resolve. When fully developed, chastity is a joyful and highly useful virtue, And so I want to talk about a bit about that today. But before I turn to talking about chastity, I want to talk a bit about the role of ideals in a Christian moral formation. It's important to understand the role of ideals in order to understand chastity, because chastity is an ideal. In her essay, An Expedition to the Poles, writer Annie Dillard compares our journey towards intimacy with God to 19th century polar expeditions that made many attempts to get to the North Pole. The quest for the North Pole was arduous, and those who were finally successful had to learn to know themselves and to adapt to polar conditions. An ideal, to use Dillard's phrase, is both a pole of most trouble and a pole of great price. An ideal is a lofty aspiration that sets in motion a moral quest. Used foolishly, ideals oppress people. We can use them to flail ourselves and to bludgeon others, and non-Christians think of Christians as doing this all the time. But used wisely, ideals can keep us moving in the right direction. They can serve as compass points for charting the course of our lives. Christians pursue the ideal of chastity, knowing that whether any particular one of us ever perfectly exemplifies it, it's still a useful ideal. Chastity is sometimes misconstrued as a mere synonym for celibacy or virginity. Virginity is a bodily state that one can lose. Apart from contentious debates about whether genital stimulation that falls short of intercourse counts as sex, virginity is an all-or-nothing matter. Either you're a virgin or you're not. For most human beings, virginity is a temporary state. In unusual cases, virginity is a lifelong calling. Sadly, in our culture, some people who are virgins see virginity as a stigma. Chastity as a virtue is different from virginity. To see this, we need to understand a few important aspects of virtue in general. And sorry, I'm going to do a little bit of philosophy here, so hang in there with me. Virtues are habits. They're settled dispositions to behave in certain ways, and they contribute to our living well as human beings. Courage is a virtue, and so is generosity and kindness and gratitude. Virtues are marked by a feeling of naturalness and a sense of enjoyment when they're exercised. Brave people face danger with comparative ease. Generous people delight in making the perfect gift. Being virtuous also comes in degrees. I'm not as cowardly as some, but there are many people who are more courageous than I am. Virtue is something that one can approximate. Aristotle taught us long ago that states of character range on a continuum. There's a difference between being virtuous and being well-behaved. A person may be well-behaved but have to struggle to do the right thing. Such a person, Aristotle called not virtuous but continent. Continent in this context means being able successfully to resist temptation to misbehave. If we think of virtue as at the top of a spectrum of states of character, then continence is the next best thing. The third best, after continence, is what Aristotle called incontinence. Like the continent, the incontinent struggle to do the right thing, but unlike the continent, the incontinent fail. Although the struggle is painful and failure is even more painful, even unsuccessful struggle is a relative sign of health, because at the bottom of the scale of states of virtue is vice, the settled disposition to behave badly and enjoy it. A person with a settled disposition to behave badly doesn't struggle. Their behavior becomes so natural to them that they hardly notice that there might be other ways of behaving. If chastity is a virtue, it is an aspect of character that a person can aspire to, achieve, stray from, and regain. One advantage to seeing chastity in the context of Aristotle's character spectrum is that it helps us see that there are three different ways of being unchaste: continence, incontinence, and the vice of lustfulness. In thinking about this, let's start at the bottom of this chart. This chart. The lustful take their behavior as a matter of course. Consider this crude comment from a male adolescent about what he would do if someone he was interested in said no to having sexual intercourse. What I would do is carry on for a little by saying, come on, are you sure? And I would tease them, and after about a half an hour or so, if they still say no, I would let up. I would say, don't worry, just give me a blowjob or a hand job instead. This young man's perception of sexuality is so colored by the plain sex and power view that he has no awareness of his own exploitive and manipulative strategies. Lustfulness seems like fun to the lustful, but seen through the covenantal, procreative, and romantic lenses, lustfulness falls far short of human flourishing. It dehumanizes others and oneself. At the top of this chart is the virtue of chastity. The virtue of chastity is not just the ability to do without sex for weeks or months. Chastity is another name for sexual integrity, an inner unity of body and spirit. Among other things, chastity keeps our sexual desires from making us view others as collections of sexually arousing body parts. Chastity can also keep us from wanting to become power flirts. A power flirt hides behind the ambiguity inherent in flirtation to arouse sexual interest with no serious intention beyond feeding his or her own ego. What about these states of characters in between chastity and lust? Those who are continent with regard to their sexuality successfully struggle against lust. They realign their attention when they find themselves objectifying others, and they make every effort to keep their sexual behavior within bounds. How much of a struggle this is for a given person may vary depending on circumstances. Self-knowledge can help people manage their environment and their desires so that the struggle need not be heroic in order to be successful. The sexually incontinent have the same struggles as those who are continent, but they are unsuccessful. They end up acting as if they're lustful and feeling terrible about their actions. Whether the Apostle Paul was talking about sexual incontinence or some other lapse of virtue in Romans 7 is unknown, but his description of incontinence is moving in its anguish. For I do not do the good I want, but the evil I do not want is what I do. Wretched man that I am, who will rescue me from this body of death? Neither continence nor incontinence is anywhere near as fun as virtue. Once a virtue has become second nature, it gives a settled sense of joy. Chastity allows us to take our sexuality wherever we go without treating other people as collections of sexualized body parts. If we are single, chastity allows us to be sexual beings while refraining from intercourse or becoming restless. If we're married, chastity allows us to desire our husband and wife as a whole person, body and soul. Chastity allows us to make love in a way that celebrates our wives' or husband's whole embodied self. Chastity helps us to be faithful to our husband or wife in health, in sickness, and ultimately in death. Whether single or married, chastity allows us to be happy and robustly embodied. When we meet people who are truly integrated sexually, they are content. They're not all fidgety or restless or self-conscious or driven. Yet they are aware and appreciative of their own bodies and those of others. They are erotic without making moves or ogling or leering or vamping. And here's the thing, some of these people are happily married and some of these people are happily single. And here's another thing. It's an extraordinarily rare human being who's never been unchaste. Regardless of whether they're a virgin, single, or remain virgins until they were married, chastity is hard work. Adolescence is turbulent. Extended adolescence is becoming a cultural commonplace. Continence, incontinence, and lust are far more common than chastity. For many, sexual integrity may seem like a distant goal. Within the church, this puts them in good company. After all, Augustine is famous for praying, "Lord, make me chaste, but not yet." The Christian tradition teaches us that chastity is an ideal towards which we should be setting our compass. Taking chastity seriously as an ideal can help us admit when we're nowhere near there yet. We can be more truthful with ourselves about ourselves, and we can be duly grateful for and admiring when we become or meet those who've reached the goal of chastity itself. By aiming at chastity, some of us will at most achieve continence. But if we lower our aspirations and aim only at continence, we're more likely to lapse into incontinence. And to the extent we excuse our incontinence as being only human, we're more likely to slide into the vice of lust. Annie Dillard notes that there's no such thing as a solo polar explorer. As bumbling as communities are, we need communities to survive and thrive, especially if we're on a moral quest. American Christianity in the 21st century is too often treating this Christian life as if it's a solo endeavor. Nowhere is this more true than in our quest for sexual integrity. If more Christians took chastity seriously as an ideal genuinely sought for, but which few are fully reached, this can open up a space for real conversation within the church about our struggles and growing edges. Less energy would be wasted on putting on a pretense of propriety. Too often in the church, sexuality is treated in polite silence, hushed confessions, tintillated gossip, or diatribes. Mutual support is impossible under such conditions. Acknowledging chastity as an ideal and making sexual integrity our corporate quest can give us the courage to be frank about sex and the grace to be compassionate. For Christians, sexual integrity is among many aspects of moral and spiritual maturity or Christ-likeness. Lots of people in our culture talk about sexual maturity. Because Christians see sexual maturity as part of spiritual maturity, we see sexual maturity as more than biological or psychological readiness for sex. Nor is sexual maturity just an ability to follow the rules. Sexual maturity is intertwined with human wholeness, with integrity. And sexual maturity and integrity are not destinations that we arrive at early in our lives. They are callings that are out in front of us our whole life long. For many of us, the quest for sexual integrity will be arduous, but it will be less foreboding if we seek this goal together as a mutually supportive church and members of the body of Christ. Because I've taken a virtue-oriented approach in this talk, I haven't assembled a long list of do's and don'ts about sexual conduct. I haven't talked about a lot of hot-button social issues like pornography or homosexuality. When we concentrate on virtue and character, we don't ignore behavior, but we see behavior as both flowing out of habits and building habits. Habits become deeply ingrained through repetition and reinforcement. They are weakened when we act in ways that are inconsistent with the habits that we want to preserve. As a virtue ethicist, when I ask myself, is this something I should do or something that I should avoid, I answer this question by focusing on the kind of person I want to become. When we face choices about how to behave sexually, I recommend that we make those choices in light of this maxim. What I am to be, I am now becoming with God's help. Thank you.
I would like to thank all of you guys for showing up, to coming this morning to hear Dr. Simon speak with us. Just so you guys know, we're going to be meeting again at 7:30 tonight in the Ribbons Academic Center in classrooms 1144 and 1148. Her topic will be, why is it so hard for Christians to talk about homosexuality? Hope to see all y'all there. Thanks.